And as we look at the aspects of love in this chapter, there are positive aspects of love and negative aspects of love. I decided to give myself the negative, the hard stuff, that way our visitors wouldn't have to worry about that so much. They could deal with the good stuff. And I didn't want to give Tony the hard stuff. Actually, I probably would have if I'd have thought about it. But we understand that to everything there are two sides of every coin. We understand God has two sides, two parts of His deity, both the good and the severe. We understand that love has two parts, those things which we should be and those things which we should not be. This morning in this time, we're going to talk about the things that we should not be. And in 1 Corinthians 13, those are outlined for us. Now, to understand any text of Scripture, we've got to go to the context. Two types of context. The immediate context, that's the verses right around what we're talking about. That would be the chapter. And then the remote context. We spread it out a little bit further. What's going on in this section of 1 Corinthians that is important to this chapter? Well, we have to understand that beginning in chapter 12, or what we know is chapter 12 through chapter 14, the whole section deals with the miraculous abilities that people had. And 1 Corinthians 13 is not written in a vacuum. What I mean by that is it's not written as a standalone piece. We often read it or understand it, maybe study it that way, but we understand that it is not in and of itself a standalone verse or a standalone chapter. It's in the context of two more chapters that deal with some problems that brothers had, brothers and sisters. In chapter 1 of 1 Corinthians, Paul begins outlining the problems that are going on in 1 Corinthians. Now, Daniel talked yesterday about loving the brotherhood. We have to be careful if we're going to start outlining the problems that someone else has in a letter. We're not Paul, are we? We have to be very cautious. Paul knew some things and knew them very well. And as he goes through those problems, of course, there are various problems that need to be fixed, just like there are in every congregation, if we're honest with ourselves. But he gets to this section where he talks about you have these abilities, but you don't know how to handle these abilities. You are thinking you are better than someone else because of the ability that you have. And as he goes through those ideas, he explains to them in chapter 12 that there's something more important than your miraculous ability. Just having a miraculous ability doesn't make you special. Balaam had a donkey that had miraculous ability. That donkey wasn't special. But we know that God can use various people, whether they're good or whether they're evil. So your miraculous ability is not making you special. What makes you special is if you have that best gift. And that best gift is described here as love or charity. Now, to understand love or charity, we need to look how those words would have been used by Paul. There are several words that are translated in English love. We have one word for love. Yet in the Greek language, actually there were four. The Bible uses three. The Bible talks about phileo, that brotherly love. Tony talked about that. It's kind affection. Kind affection. That closeness, that relationship, that friendship that we want to have. As a matter of fact, it's described or even translated as friendship from time to time. As I believe Tony put it, we don't have to be friends with everybody. That's not the type of love that's necessary between us and every other individual on earth. But the key one that we find is in this section, agape. This is, I'm looking out for your best interest. Now on Friday night, Charles was preaching and he said something, and after the sermon I asked him, I said, did Dan Winkler ruin one of your best sermons too? And he said, yeah, how did you know? Well, you heard what he said about the J-O-Y, and I've probably said that before too. Well, Dan Winkler preached a sermon on that and said, no, Christ is our life. Everything includes Him. And I think that's a great point. But we do have to remember that true love is putting others before ourselves. That's part of it. Christ is our life, so to be Christ-like, we have to love, but to love means to look out for others first. If there's someone in need, we help. James talks about that. Those who have faith, if they don't help, what good is their faith? Well, it's useless and worthless. So as Paul describes this type of love, this agape, this helping others before themselves, we understand that he's not talking about phileo. That brotherly kindness, sometimes it's defined or described as, or friendship. He's also not talking about eros, not the place down the road. He's not talking about, we get words like erotic from it. He's not talking about the fuzzy feeling in the stomach. That's what eros is. Someone says, I have fallen in love. What do they mean? I have fuzzy, butterflies in my stomach when I'm around someone. That's not agape. That's not phileo. That's eros. You have some feelings. You have some emotions. And those are part of it. As a matter of fact, that's part of a marriage relationship. But that's not what's being discussed here. Again, what's being discussed is agape, looking out for others before yourself. Of course, we've looked at Christ as the perfect example of that when we see what He did for us. Now, I want to notice now, let's get down to the main part of our sermon today or this morning. What is love not? Love is a lot of things, but love is also not several things. I want you to notice, if you'll go down to verse 4 of 1 Corinthians 13, we begin a section that talks about all the things that love or charity is not. Charity is a word. The reason some people might ask, why does the King James Version translate it charity? Well, the King James translators were very, they had not been out of Catholicism very long. And the Latin Vulgate is a Latin translation of the Bible, which they really cling to. And in the Latin Vulgate, it used a Latin word that is, we understand as charity. So that's where the charity part, but it's the same word that's translated love in just about every other section or circumstance. So what is love not? Verse 4. Of course, it begins with a couple of positives. Charity, or love, suffereth long and is kind. Now let's get down to the negatives. First, charity envieth not. Love is not envious. What's interesting about the word envious is that it comes from a word that in other locations is translated zealous. As a matter of fact, in the Greek language, it's zeloi. Zealous. Don't be zealous. Wait a minute. I thought we were supposed to be zealous. The Bible teaches us to have zeal and great desire to do what's right. But in this circumstance, it's a word that can be used two ways, good or bad. In this circumstance, he's saying love does not have a zeal for other people's things and other people's abilities and the recognition that other people gain. Remember the context again. What was going on? People were looking at this and they were saying, I have a better ability, miraculous ability than you do. The other person was saying, no. I have a greater miraculous ability than you do. And for some reason, speaking in tongues was the miraculous ability that people wanted. Oddly enough, the tongue speaker had to have a translator. They needed someone else to make sure the message was being given. So there was a problem there. And some people who didn't speak in tongues were looking at those who did, and they were zealous for that ability. They wanted it. They desired it for their own. Well, love is not zealous for other people's things, envious. Of course, envy takes jealousy to an extreme. Jealousy is desiring someone else's things. Envy is, I want your thing so much that I hope you suffer. I hope you lose it. I hope that promotion you get, I hope you get fired. That's what envy does. It goes even beyond jealousy, that old green-eyed monster. We look, and again, we understand in the remote context, 1 Corinthians chapter 3, do you remember what Paul said about these people's attitudes? In verse 3. Beginning there and in the following verses, he talks about how one says, well, I am of Apollos. I'm better than you are. Another one says, wait. I'm of Paul. I'm better than you are. Another says, I'm of Peter. Peter preached the first gospel sermon that's recorded for us. I am of Peter. Another says, no, I'm of Christ. And sadly, it seems by the text that they were not using that idea of being of Christ in a good way. They were using it in a negative way to stir up envy in others. And that was the point of what they were doing. Sometimes we do that, don't we? I was baptized by fill in the blank of the big name preacher. Oh, such and such preached my wedding. Don't you wish he preached yours? Wait a minute. We've put our trust in the wrong thing. They were zealous over the abilities or the attitudes or maybe the things that these other people had done or they had, and that was wrong. We shouldn't be the same. We shouldn't do that. Love is not envious. In James chapter 3 and verse 13, James describes this idea of envy. And he says, envy, of course it's not good. Where does it come from? It says it's earthly, devilish. It's not from heaven. Envy doesn't come from heaven. If we have envy and strife within us, that's not something God has given. That's not something that God has sent down to us to have. We understand that some people have more material blessings than others. That's all right. Abraham was a very rich man. Job. Several in the New Testament we read about. The Apostle Paul described it this way in Philippians chapter 4. He said, I know how to be rich. I know how to have abundance, but I also know how to have nothing. He says, I've learned with whatever position that I'm in to be content. And that's the answer for envy. Being content with what we have. And that's the context in which he says, I can do all things through Christ that strengtheneth me. He's saying it doesn't matter if I have great wealth or no wealth. I can still do what God wants me to do. We shouldn't have envy one to another. Charity, love, envieth not. Charity vaunteth not itself. Love is not boastful. Love is not boastful. In Matthew chapter 6, Jesus there is preaching the Sermon on the Mount, and he says there are individuals who, when they give, now this sounds ridiculous, but history lays it out that they did this. That when they gave, they would blow a trumpet. Blow a trumpet. Look at me. Look at what I've done. Look at how great I am. Look at how much money I've given. And Jesus goes on later to tell the story about the widow's 2 mites. Others were giving great amounts of money and they wanted everybody to see it, and then the widow had 2 mites. She gave them both. He said that woman is truly the one that's given, not those others. They wanted to give alms and they wanted people to see them. Look what I've done. Look how great I am. He goes on and describes that with prayer. Prayer. When we pray, are we trying to show our vocabulary? The Pharisees were. They would get in the street corners and there in the synagogues, and they would lift up their hands and their head toward God, and they would pray such. And Luke 18 bears out one time Jesus talking about that. We'll deal with that more in just a minute. But they were praying so that people could see them. And they were saying, look at me, look how great I am. One thing that's interesting, Jesus talked about those Pharisees and how they would wear even larger clothes and wear all of this stuff. They wanted to have more and be better than other people. Based on Deuteronomy chapter 6, it says that, those who followed God under the Old Testament law should keep that law between the frontlets of their eyes. Well, many of these Pharisees and others would actually make a box. And in that box, they would put a scroll. And on that scroll, it would say those words that it said previously to that. Hear, O Israel, the Lord our God, the Lord is one. They would put that there. But here's what's funny. The boxes began getting bigger and bigger and bigger. Why? They wanted to show how wonderful they were. My box is bigger. I'm more spiritual. Well, they missed it, didn't they? And of course, Jesus again talked about fasting. When you fast, here's what they would do. They would make themselves look as if they were in just terrible condition, as if they were almost sick. They would walk around hunched over from historian records, and they would allow their face to be disfigured and walk around like everything's terrible. Jesus said, wash your face. In our language, comb your hair. Make sure you look right. Don't let people see that you're doing that fasting, because if you do, you have your reward. People saw you. In Isaiah chapter 6, I think all boasting would end if we would, in our mind and in our imagination, do what Isaiah did. Now, Isaiah saw a vision. And in Isaiah chapter 6, Isaiah was walked in that vision into the throne room of God. And he saw some amazing things. And because of that, he was humbled and not boastful. Sometimes people act like they could walk into God's throne room and say, God, get up, that's my seat. That's not right. What did Isaiah say? I'm undone. He saw this amazing imagery of God's throne room and he said, I am undone. I'm a man of unclean lips and amongst a people of unclean lips. I'm undone. I'm unclean. There's no room for boasting when we look back to God. There's no room for boasting when we look back to Christ, that perfect example of love. When we look at Christ and understand what He did, what in the world can we say we've done? Jesus talked about those in that last day that say, Lord, Lord, we've done this and that and the other. Look how wonderful we are. How in the world can man tell Jesus how great they are and what they've done for Him? It doesn't work that way. Love's not boastful. We continue reading and it says, is not puffed up. 1 Corinthians 13:4. It's not puffed up. Love is not arrogant. In 1 Corinthians chapter 5, there was a situation going on in the Corinthian church, and the church there in Corinth, and Paul said, you're puffed up. You're prideful. What does he mean by that? You're overlooking something that you should not be overlooking. He said this is something that was so bad, even the Gentiles wouldn't allow it. Even the people in the world around you wouldn't allow it. Yet you allow it in your midst. Why are you doing that? Because you're boastful. You think you're better than God. You've told God to get off the throne so you can sit down. There was a problem with that. We talked about that Pharisee in Luke 18 that Jesus discussed. Remember when He prayed? We talked about prayer just a couple of weeks ago, Sunday morning Bible class, and nowhere in Jesus' model prayer, which outlines the types of things that we should say, nowhere in the model prayer did Jesus ever say, pray to the Father and tell Him how good you are. That Pharisee stood up and said, oh, God, I'm so glad that I'm not like that tax collector over there. Look how great I am. I do this and I do this and I do this and I do this. He missed it. Jesus said that tax collector who smote his breast, he beat his chest out of righteous indignation over his situation, and he said, God, have mercy on me. a sinner. There's no room for arrogance in love. Think about King Herod in Acts chapter 12. Not Herod the Great, but the Herod in Acts chapter 12. You remember he set himself up as God. He had killed James the apostle, set himself up as God. He didn't get the last laugh. God caused him to be eaten by worms. Acts 12 and 20 through 23. Why? Because he had puffed himself up with arrogance. Told God to get off the throne so he could sit down. In the book of Numbers, chapter 20, Moses. Remember, Moses was told one time as they were wandering in the wilderness, you need water, Moses. Your people need water. Go strike the rock. Water will come forth. The second time, God said, Moses, if you need water, go speak to the rock and water will come forth. And so Moses got before the people of Israel. Some people say, well, the problem was Moses striking the rock the second time. The problem didn't start there. The problem was, listen to what Moses' words are. Hear now, ye rebels. Shall we fetch water for you out of this rock? Where was the problem? Moses didn't say, God's going to get you some water. He said, do I need to get you water? Do you mean me and Aaron need to do this for you again? You rebels. Moses missed it, and because of that, he missed the promised land. He saw it, but he didn't set foot in it. I want you to think about one more thing. The Apostle Paul, who had risen among people his age to the heights of Judaism. He had risen to the location where you find people that are extremely boastful. Paul likely, if he would have continued in Judaism, would have risen to the very top. The same people that Jesus had to continually say, scribes, Pharisees, hypocrites. Yet the Apostle Paul, in Ephesians 3, in verse 8, said, unto me, who am less than the least of all the saints. Paul showed the opposite of arrogance. He showed humility. Love is not arrogant. Love is not rude. Look what it says in verse 5. Doth not behave itself unseemly, of 1 Corinthians 13. Doth not behave itself unseemly. The idea behind that is rude. As a matter of fact, the word that's in there is, part of it is the word scheme, or the word from which we get scheme, or the plan, scheme. And then it has an A at the beginning, which negates it. It means you are acting without planning or without thinking. That's rudeness. And the truth of the matter is, all of us fall into this category at some point or another. There's a thing between our brain and our mouth called a filter. There's not really, but our brain is our filter. But I always say there's a thing between our brain and our mouth, and it's a filter, and we need to make sure we use it. Sadly, some of us have cut the filter off, thrown it away. Some people will say, well, that's just how I am. I'm going to tell you how I see it. The Lord said, be swift to hear, slow to speak, slow to wrath, rudeness. Are we going to walk around with rudeness? You know, I've seen Christians treat waiters and waitresses in unbelievable ways. I've seen Christians treat cashiers in unbelievable ways. I've seen Christians treat workers doing work for them in unbelievable ways. It's not the way it ought to be. We ought to be the most generous, the most gracious, and the most kind people on the face of the earth. Yet how often do we show that? You didn't do it right. Fix it. Come on. Really? Our hotel gave us some problems. Evidently, they're under new management. And they didn't do things very well. And I was aggravated because I was the one that had to go fix it. And on Friday night, I said, Larry, will you walk in with me? I said, I'm going to be good, but just make sure you're there for me. And I was good. You'll be glad. Even though they had made some pretty bad mistakes. Sometimes people are going to make mistakes. Sometimes it's an honest mistake. It doesn't give us the right to be mean or rude to anyone. We're not going to act unseemly. We continue on and it says, love seeks or seeketh not her own. In other words, love's not selfish. Love is not selfish. Think about the greatest example of love in Jesus, and He committed the most unselfish act in the history of man. He went to the cross not because He needed it, but because we did. He could have stayed right there in heaven and everything been all right for Him, but not for us. We needed it. Jesus was not selfish. As a matter of fact, in Matthew 20 and verse 28, He says that I came not to be ministered to, or I came not to be served, but to minister to others, to serve others. Jesus came in and washed the feet of His disciples. I need to work on that. Because if you ask me to wash your feet, I'm probably going to say no. He's still working on me. He's still working on all of us. Unselfishness is the definition of love. Love doesn't act in a selfish way. Philippians 2 talks about Jesus leaving the portals of heaven, coming to earth, living as a man, dying in submission because we need it. Love is not selfish. We continue on reading in that verse, and it says, is not easily provoked. Love is not irritable. Love is not grouchy. Love is not always aggravated. Love can take things sometimes that hate can't. Think about Jesus. As He was being tried in that mock of a trial, what did it say about Him? It says He held His peace. He spoke, but only when necessary. He was that lamb who was dumb, unable to speak, or didn't speak. He was able. Who was dumb before his shearers. In 1 Peter 2 and verse 23, it says, when He was reviled, He reviled not again. He didn't turn it around on the other person. That's hard. When someone is treating you in a certain way, it's hard not to return evil for evil. It's hard when someone raises their voice to keep yours low, to keep mine low. You know, some of the places, the place where I've heard some of the loudest voices. The people who I've heard some of the loudest voices, raised voices from. members of the church. We need to work on that. Love is not irritable. Love is not looking for an opportunity to get mad. Love is not walking around with a chip on our shoulder begging somebody to knock it off. Love doesn't act that way. It continues on and it says, love thinketh no evil. The word there, thinketh, is an accounting term. It means, and as a matter of fact, the American Standard Version translates it this way, love takes no account of evil. I think this is one that is especially important between husbands and wives. How many times have you gotten into an argument and you've gotten historical? I didn't say hysterical. I said historical. Well, do you remember what you did back there? We'll go back years and years. Do you remember what you did? Let me tell you what you did. Wait a minute. Slow down. Love doesn't have a little black book of bad things that we've ever done. I heard a preacher talking about two elders who walked around with literal black books. You're talking about lording it over the flock. And they were watching. Up, up. I saw you. Got it right here. Love doesn't do that. Love understands we're going to have problems and make mistakes and do things that other people don't like. Love understands that. And as a matter of fact, the positive characteristics will explain that. Love doesn't do that. Love tries to forget those things. Hey, you did something I don't like. I just need to forget it. Get over it. Get away from it. Now, that doesn't mean, and again, especially with husbands and wives, when your spouse brings up something you did a long time ago, please don't say get over it. Because they won't. That doesn't work, okay? We've got to get those things out of our mind. Also, the idea of this section here is not being suspicious of everything and everybody. Looking for the evil, the bad in everybody. Jesus didn't do that, did He? When Jesus ate with the sinners and the tax collectors, He wasn't there sitting with them saying, well, let me tell you what you've done, sinner. Let me tell you what you've done. Oh, look at your list. I know everything, and I've got it right here. Jesus didn't come into the sinner and the publican's houses, and the first thing they do is say, let me show you how wrong you are. I think we've got sometimes a problem with that. Jesus built relationships. And from those relationships He taught and uplifted and strengthened. Love is not reminded of evil. Love is not looking for evil. It's not looking for the problems in everybody. Love is not suspicious of everything and everybody. We ought not to be that way. We continue on and it says there in verse 6, love rejoices not in iniquity. Now the second half of this verse I'm leaving for Tony. But love rejoices not in iniquity. Love is not joyful in failure. When you watch the news, sadly, a lot of times the news becomes the gossip column. And on the news, they're waiting for one of these stars or starlets to go to rehab, or to get a divorce, be caught with some other woman. They're waiting for these things to happen. So they can look at them and say, look how far you've fallen. You're not so good after all. Love doesn't do that. When love sees a person in a situation like that, love grieves over that. I want you to think about Matthew chapter 7. In Matthew chapter 7, the first verse of the chapter is often misused and abused. Judge that ye be not judged. Well, Jesus doesn't stop there. As a matter of fact, He doesn't say judge not. He says, judge not that you be not judged. For with the same measure you meet, it'll be measured to you. With the same judgment you have, the same way you'll be judged. In other words, don't tell somebody to stop drinking and then you go drink. Don't tell somebody to stop cursing and you go curse. Don't tell somebody to live right and you go out and live wrong. It doesn't work that way. And Jesus goes on to say, if you're walking around trying to get specks out of people's eyes and you got a beam in your eye, you've got it wrong. Get the beam out of your own eye first. The person with the beam in their eye and looking for the specks in others is a person that no doubt has to rejoice in failure. You know, it's not always the easiest thing to see our sin, is it? Ask David. Nathan had to come right out and say, look, David, talking about you. It's not always easy to see our sin. But it's real easy to see yours. It's real easy to see your faults and how you need to change and how you need to correct your behavior and how wrong you are. It's easy to see that. Jesus says until you can learn to see yours, leave everybody else's alone. Love doesn't rejoice in failure, sin. Love doesn't rejoice when people stumble, when people fall. I've known of congregations where people would be baptized and they don't look quite like everybody else, maybe don't dress like everybody else, don't act like everybody else, have a different background, have a different way of doing things, maybe don't have the best clothing and the best situation, and they're converted and they're brought in, and after a period of time, because of the wicked lifestyle they lived before, they're drawn back out in the world, and people in the church say, whew, I'm so glad they went back out in the world, because they weren't like us. We want to keep this thing tight. We want to make sure that everybody here is just like me and you. That's not what love does. Love does not rejoice in failure. And finally, love never fails. Verse 8. Love never fails. Do you love somebody? You might make a mistake, but your love for them will never fail. Your love will never fail for the young girl who's had an abortion. You don't have to agree. You don't. You shouldn't. Abortion's terrible. But your love for that person will never fail. Your love for the homosexual will never fail. You don't need to agree with what they do. It's wrong. But your love for them will never fail. Your love for the drunkard will never fail. You shouldn't agree with what they're doing. But your love for them should never fail. If you don't love them, you don't love. Jesus said, what do you have over the heathen who see one another and salute one another and encourage and strengthen one another, but they don't get outside the bounds of those close relationships? Love never fails to anyone at any time. While we might fail in our actions, If we love, we'll correct it. If we love, we'll treat people the way we want to be treated. You know, when Jesus gave that, what we call the golden rule, He didn't give that golden rule only to people who do what you think they should do. He didn't give the golden rule only to the people that follow His word. That golden rule is to apply to everyone. Love is not envious. Love is not boastful. Love is not arrogant. Love is not rude or selfish or irritable. Love is not reminded of evil. Love is not joyful in failure. And love does not fail. Let's take a break.